April 2018, I published a video with my predictions for the 2018 midterm elections. I said that it would be a Democratic wave year, but that it would nonetheless be very hard for Democrats to win either the Senate, mostly due to which specific seats were up that year, or the House, due to the winner-take-all system we use to elect the House. In fact, 2018 was a Democratic wave year. It was probably the most heavily Democratic year in my lifetime. Democrats nonetheless lost seats in the Senate, picking up Nevada, the single Democratic-leaning state up that year, as well as Arizona, and managing to keep West Virginia and Montana, but losing 3 of the other heavily Republican states up that year, as well as Florida. They needed a net win of 2 seats for a majority, and they wound up with a net loss of 2 seats. This does not negate it being a Democratic wave year. The issue was not who voters wanted. The issue was that only 1/3 of the Senate seats are elected each cycle, and for Democrats, just the wrong set of seats were up in 2018. Democrats were defending several seats in states that Trump had won by large margins, while Republicans had few seats up at all, and most of them were in safe Republican states. They did win a majority of the House, with some impressive upsets. Democrats took 4 new seats from Republicans in districts that Trump had won by over a 10-point margin. And altogether, they picked up 41 new seats, winning a 54% majority in the House. I ended my video with a plea to Americans to consider how we elect our representatives, because the current system treats voters completely unequally, favoring some over others for arbitrary reasons. And if you agree with me that we need to change how we elect Congress, just wait till you hear about how we elect the president. Going into 2020, all eyes are on the presidential election. The evidence for how the country will vote is incredibly one-sided, so just to make it as clear as possible, if you think Donald Trump will win the popular vote in 2020, then you live in some sort of bubble. All the evidence suggests that 2020 will also be a Democratic wave year and that Joe Biden will win the popular vote for president. There is really only one counter to this, that in 2016 everyone said that Hillary Clinton would win, but then she lost. This, I think, amounts to a major misunderstanding of what happened in 2016. That year the polls did favor Clinton most of the cycle, but they also swung up and down during the season, and they were significantly narrowing as Election Day approached. And even still, Clinton did win the popular vote. She earned about 3 million more votes than Donald Trump. However, the systems that we use to count votes consider some worth more than others. In late October, 538 actually warned that the polls were making it look more and more likely that Clinton would win the popular vote but lose the election. Exactly what happened. This cycle, the polls are much more stable. Under 538's model, Joe Biden has never dropped below a 67% chance of victory or gone above a 79% chance of victory. Compare that to Clinton, whose chances varied between a 49% and 89% chance during the same time frame. This year's consistency suggests that people's minds are largely made up already. They'll probably keep their opinions through Election Day, barring some surprising turn of events that somehow is more impactful on public opinion than, all of this. So the only reasonable prediction is that Joe Biden will probably win, but note that Joe Biden's chances of victory have still not exceeded the margin of error. A 67% chance of victory is far from a sure thing. Finally, I've mentioned the Electoral College a couple times offhand, but it deserves a fuller explanation. When the Constitution was drafted, the original plan submitted by James Madison would have had Congress choose the president. However, the framers did not want the president to be directly accountable to Congress, so they created this idea of the Electoral College. Each state would choose a number of electors equal to their representation in Congress. Those electors would meet in their respective state capitals to cast their votes for president and vice president. It's like a single-serving Congress. To win the presidency, a candidate needs to earn a majority of those electoral votes. Technically, the states can pick their electors by any means they want. They do not actually have to hold an election. But every state does hold an election, and every state except Nebraska and Maine elects a full slate of electors based on who wins the most votes in that state. If Joe Biden wins the most votes in Arizona, say, then the 11 electors chosen by the Arizona Democratic Party will be the ones casting Arizona's votes for president and vice president. In Maine and Nebraska, 2 electors are chosen statewide, and then 1 is chosen in each of the state's congressional districts. These electors will vote on December 14th, 2020. That's the actual presidential election. Technically, the electors can vote for whoever they want, irrespective of who appointed them, but in practice, they almost always vote for their party's nominee, making them rubber stamps for their state's voters. Some states actually require them to vote for their party's nominee by law, and the Supreme Court upheld the right of states to require that just this year. In practice, most of these details just don't matter. When the framers put this system in place, many of them thought we would be choosing electors based on how smart and civic-minded the electors were. But because they've been reduced to rubber stamps for their parties, the actual impact is just to filter our presidential votes through a state-by-state system that renders most of our votes meaningless. I live in Maryland, say, and everyone knows Joe Biden will win Maryland, so it doesn't actually matter who I individually vote for. On the other hand, no candidate has won the presidential election without winning the most votes in Florida since 1992, so clearly their votes matter a whole lot. Some people say we need this system to protect the interests of small states or rural voters, or that it protects against the tyranny of the majority. Going fully into these arguments is beyond the scope of this video, but suffice to say, Maryland is smaller than Florida and equally rural, and I see no reason to think that Maryland's voters are more tyrannical than Florida's. To me, it seems more like the Electoral College system is biased in a completely arbitrary way, but some people like the results it's produced recently. The upshot of all this is that to see who will win the presidential election, we need to look past national polls into who is winning particular states. This also favors Joe Biden, but it is closer. In 2016, Donald Trump won a majority of the electoral vote, even though more people voted for Hillary Clinton, and there's a reasonable chance that could happen again in 2020. A lot of people are also talking about how President Trump and other Republicans will react if Trump loses in anything other than a crystal clear blowout. The nation is unprepared for a slew of recounts, and over the past few weeks we have seen political polarization elevate into mortal violence. Maybe the election will come and go without anything more serious than the usual bluster, but these are strange days, and it's possible the presidential election gets resolved in a way that can't be predicted by either data or through a thorough education in civics. Prior to the recent death of Justice Ginsburg, most media was completely focused on the presidential election. That death and the following controversy regarding her replacement has quite rightly drawn attention to the election of Congress that will take place in 2020. 1/3 of the Senate is elected every cycle, along with all 435 seats in the House. The Senate alone is responsible for confirming judges, but both the House and Senate are critical for changing laws and appropriating money. So what do we know about how those elections will go? In the 2018 video, I mentioned the generic ballot as a way to assess how likely voters were to vote for a Democrat or Republican if the election were held today. In support of 2018 being a Democratic wave year, I showed that Democrats were up by about 6 points in the generic ballot at that time in mid-April. In mid-April of this year, Democrats were up by 8 points, and it got as high as 9 in early July. The field is also more level, especially in the Senate. There are 12 Democratic-held seats and 21 Republican-held seats up for election, and in terms of the reasonably competitive states, it's about even. Democrats will need to net 3 seats to tie the Senate, or 4 for an outright majority. Democrat Doug Jones will probably lose his seat in Alabama, so Democrats will need to win 4 or 5 states held by Republicans while not losing Michigan. That's all totally within the realm of the possible, with Colorado, Maine, North Carolina, and Georgia all being reasonably winnable states if 2020 is a Democratic-leaning year. Democrats have been polling well in Iowa as well, putting an outright majority well within reach. The House varies less year to year, so a lot of what I said in 2018 remains true. The system we use to elect the House is badly biased in favor of Republicans. There are only 3 districts this year with Republican incumbents that Clinton won, but there are 29 districts with Democratic incumbents that were won by Trump. Defending those 29 districts will be a Herculean task. It is unthinkable that Democrats will hold all of them. Meanwhile, there's really only 1 Republican seat where Democrats are actually favored to win, and it's a bit of a fluke. California 25 was actually won by a Democrat in 2018. That was Katie Hill's district. The Republican incumbent won it in a special election after Hill was forced to resign due to a series of events that, without going into it too much, probably would not have resulted in her resignation if she were a man. Anyway, Clinton won that district by 11 points, so although the polls show a tight race, probably the Democrat will win it in November. As of September 4th, there are 41 open seats, districts where the incumbent is not seeking re-election. We can approximate how competitive those districts are by looking at the 2016 presidential vote in them. In only 8 of them was the Trump-Clinton vote within a 10-point margin, and 7 of those 8 were previously held by Republicans, making them potential places for Democrats to gain ground, but also 7 of those 8 are districts that Trump won, so Republicans will be favored to win most of them. Altogether, the field as a whole is not friendly to Democrats. Even though Clinton won more votes than Trump nationally in 2016, Trump won more votes than Clinton in 227 of the 435 congressional districts, about 52% of them. If 2020 is another heavily Democratic year, they will probably keep their majority, but they will almost definitely lose seats. After this year's election, we will have the results from the national census. And in 2021, every state will need to draw new congressional districts, with some states gaining more seats and others losing some. The redistricting that took place after the 2010 census was historically corrupt, with Republicans specifically targeting state legislatures where they could draw blatantly biased districts. Last year, the Supreme Court said that intentionally drawing severely skewed maps was legal, specifically prohibiting federal courts from hearing any new challenges to them, no matter how egregious they were. No one party controls enough states to systematically gerrymander the country the way Republicans did in 2011, but we should nonetheless expect to see severe fights over district lines in particular states, as well as litigation ongoing through the decade. What we as voters need to understand is that every hour and every dollar spent trying to influence district lines rather than voters is proof of how diluted our role in a democracy has become. We only use districts at all because of a law passed in 1967. It is a bad system. With the right will, we can change that law to institute a fairer and more proportional system.